We'll wait for 2 more minutes, 2 or 3 more minutes. We're just waiting for a few people to arrive, and then we're about to start. So just give us a few minutes. Colleagues, a warm welcome to you. And for our guests in the room as well as those online, feel welcome. We have a welcome later on. I will regard this as a warm-up welcome. My name is Gloria Britton, and I will be the program director for the first session. Look at your program. The launch is divided into sessions, and I'll be doing the first part of it. I'd like to start off by just saying this is the reason we are here today, as you all know. We are launching the State of the South African State, which is the end result of many months of research by a very important group of people. The subtitle is Capacity, Capability and Ethics, and I'm sure that's the reason that you are all here this morning. We are firstly very grateful to Business Leadership South Africa, who has partnered with us and made this venue, this other resources available for us to host today. Then I need to say that we are pleased to have a number of important guests, amongst them a bit later on and online will be Minister Ramaphosa, the Minister of the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. She will say a few words later on. And we have Deputy Minister Andries Nel of Justice here with us this morning as well. We have authors, we have our editors here, we have fellows, we have MISTRA partners, and we are really pleased that you have joined us this morning. Before we get on with the program, a few housekeeping notes. You might have noticed from my voice and trying to project my voice, we don't have actual mics in the room. There are mics situated in the room. So we ask if you do want to contribute.
Hello. Yes.
That you just try and project your voice so that we can all hear you. For the audience online, they will hear us very clearly, I'm told. Then for our online attendees, please start posting your questions as soon as you have one. We have somebody who's monitoring and we'll feed it into the Q&A later on. And then, as always, we will be posting live during the morning. We have people who will be tweeting and posting on different social media platforms. Should you want to join in that conversation online, I'll run through the handles very quickly. On the LinkedIn page, you will know it's Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection and in brackets MISTRA. On Facebook page, it's the same. You can search, you'll find it quite easily. On X, the handle is @MISTRA_SA. Find that quite easily. And then to get to the specific conversation of today, there's a hashtag, State of the SA State. Every word is capital. And it's one word, no spaces. Or hashtag MISTRA, capital letters, SOSL launch. And I went through that quickly, but we can announce it again if you need. We're going to start the program today with a keynote address by Prof. Samadoda Fakine, will join us online to address us. It's a great honor for me to introduce him today. Prof is the chairperson of the Public Service Commission of South Africa. I'm sure many of us know him in that capacity. He's a respected academic, policy analyst and commentator. He holds a PhD in comparative politics and public policy analysis from Michigan State University. And as we all know already, he has held senior roles in higher education, heritage institutions, and is widely known for his insights on governance, development, and social transformation. So I just need to check if we have Prof. Kelly online.
Yep.
Ready? Okay. Prof, the floor and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and also it's such an honor to be invited to share some pointers on this very important day of the launch of the book, which is both timely and timeless given our challenges as South Africa, the state of the South African state. And I also congratulate MISTRA for yet again producing another nugget on time and very topical issue. I recognize Professor Velnkomo and the leadership of MISTRA. I recognize, as you did mention, that the minister in the presidency is also in your midst, and all other guests that I might not have noticed. But special congratulations to the editors and the authors who contributed to this very important piece of work. The first thing I want to say is a disclaimer. Each time I'm asked to give a keynote address, I always start with a disclaimer to say, I prefer a keyhole address rather than a keynote address. A keyhole, it's where you bring a bunch of keys and you try to fit various keys to open the door. It is where you use the opening in the door to peep on the other side to see what exists in the other room in all its shape and form. And a keynote address very often threatens to provide a new thesis, a new treatise, and that is not what I am going to do. Just going to highlight a few things which I think are quite pertinent to this very important day. The first one, especially now that I'm with the Public Service Commission and also looking at the literature, going back, the institution called state is probably the most important institution as a service provider and as the one that leads development in almost all societies. And this has been the case even in the pre-colonial period, during the colonial period, up to this day. There was a time in social sciences, especially in political science, when there was a debate whether you need a small state with a bigger role of the private sector, therefore the state shrinking. This came at the time or in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the East Bloc, which was a socialist bloc, wherein the state was seen as overbearing. Therefore, the private sector had to play a role in the liberal market-driven system. This was celebrated in the early 90s by many scholars in the West, like Francis Fukuyama, who even wrote The End of History in one of his books, saying that now these ideological battles were over. And this was followed by many other writings by economists, by political scientists, and some researchers attached to institutions such as the World Bank and so forth, were claiming that state has to be very lean, very small, and play minimum role, simply create conditions. But fast forward to the 21st century today, with the geopolitics, with many other calamities that we've seen as COVID-19, the financial crisis of 2008, you have seen how central the role of the state is. Fast forward today to countries during the Brazil Lula presidency, the first one, when you could see 70 million people lifted out of poverty. And China recently had made claims that hundreds, of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in 20 years. Look at the role played by many countries across Europe, in the US, in Asia, the Asian tigers and so forth, and the discourse around the developmental state, which have actually anchored the centrality of the state, which we cannot avoid invoking. And it was the same Francis Fukuyama who, in 2004, wrote again about the importance of the state. He was now more humble. He had retreated from his end of the state theory. And you were beginning to see the developmental state and the role of the state, even the World Bank itself affirming that effective, efficient, capable institutions of the state were very much important. But let's come to the South African context now. South Africa is a very complex society which has many layers of what has created the architecture of state today. Right from the pre-colonial period, colonial period, up to the transition in 1994, what you had was a combination of different institutions. One, some of those were the colonial states which is your Afrikaner or the Boer republics, as well as the English ones, which came together in the Union of South Africa in 1910. That involved the merging of institutions at that time, and it was precisely around that time in 1912 that the Public Service Commission of the then colonial regime was established. So it turns out to be one of the oldest of the institutions. And you also had the incorporation of various chiefdoms and kingdoms into that particular arrangement. Again, in 1994, you had this amalgamation of homelands, both self-governing and the independent homeland systems, as well as what was then the apartheid state. There was even a period in terms of the reforms of the state where a sunset clause was put in to say for 5 years, we will leave as many of the bureaucrats in place and some of the key figures in the statecraft so that it allows for a smooth transition, whilst also assuring those who were quite nervous as to what a democratic black majority government would look like. You also saw the attempt of integrating the security forces in the army, in the police, and that process is still an ongoing business, which has been reflected as such. But now let's come to the South Africa of today when we reflect on the notion of a state. We started very well replacing the apartheid regime, and the state was performing its function. It was showing effectiveness as the RDP program was being implemented. You could see the material changes. You could see the material benefits of this transition. What was essentially a bankrupt state, you were beginning to see economy growing from its crisis as the transition period. South Africa was emerging from isolation. It had many financial challenges. It had the deficit, and also it was technically a bankrupt state out of that isolation. You begin to see the rolling out of programs of RDP, whether it's housing, electrification, water, and so forth, in the first 10 years or so of the post-apartheid state. In this case, you could see the effectiveness of the state. And as such, all indicators, economic growth, and you begin to see the standardization and harmonization of certain social security benefits across racial groups instead of the staggered ones that we had seen before. So during this period, we do see solid performance of the state. We could see the leadership, we could see the director generals, the HODs, the mayors. Those were quite heavyweight in many ways. The quality of the leadership cohort that was there, both from the apartheid regime or the liberation movements and some from the homelands. So you could see during that period the impact. The economy by 2005 was growing at a tantalizing range of 5%, very close to that. But now you begin to see what I would call a patrimonial system taking root, the patronage system, where you do see corruption, you do see some kind of, weakening of institutions, whilst personalities were rising to replace those institutions. And this in itself, unfortunately, was accompanied by the decline of economy, which started shrinking and regressing. and the reversal of the very gains which we had seen before. So we've seen many writers trying to say, how do we then describe the South African state? Is it a failed state, as some say, which in social scientists, they would not be so much, in a rush to classify it as such? Is it a state in crisis, a fragile state in its complexity? Some have said it's a mafia state. As you see the Madlanga Commission and others, you see some enclaves where the criminal syndicates seem to have penetrated the very law enforcement and the state itself. Some have said that it is actually a weak state. So there are different descriptions that have come even during the 30-year review of South Africa's performance to say what kind of state do we have. But what is quite clear is that a state that had started to perform well started declining in many indicators. And some are describing the current phase as the phase of recovery. And of course, the verdict is still out there. Even the Indlulamity scenarios, which is projecting to 2035, the three storylines of the vulture culture, of the Hadida, of the weaver bird. It is indicating the issue of state capacity to implement its programs, to enforce law as one of the big challenges. And of course, the performance of economy is one of the key drivers. The same state, during the same period of 31 years, produces one of the most unequal societies in the world. And some people begin to say, do we have here an elite pact wherein both the political and the business elite have come together and have common cause in which they benefit? And the irony of this is that all this is happening under the nose for most of the part, for most of this transition period of a liberation movement which had embraced egalitarian principles. Therefore, when we analyze the state, we ought to be asking ourselves, what exactly happened? What could produce and reproduce such levels of inequality? Is it the elite pact? Is it the resistance by those who were in control, and the state, instead of transforming that reality, has been transformed into that reality in the hegemonic and counter-hegemonic struggles of the power and the balance of power? So what we have today is what I would describe a complex state that is showing signs of decay and signs of renewal all at the same time. There are elements in the same state wherein, when you assess the performance of South African state in comparative terms, because I do know that most of the time, people who look at South Africa and people who are based in South Africa tend to have the South African exceptionalism. We never say, when we say the state is failing, we never say compared to which other states, how are we performing in comparative terms? Yes, there are indexes which come in to indicate how we rank, but very often our discourse as a country, we tend to just look at this institution, the South African state. For example, when we say we are failing to enforce law, we are failing to hold the political figures and the big businesses accountable. That, to some degree, might be true because of the weaknesses of our law enforcement. But at the same time, when you look at the fact that former president of the country was jailed, Speaker of Parliament was charged, ministers have been charged, and you compare that to other countries, such as Israel, such as the US, and many others, and you begin to see what some are saying it's a democratic slide there. Again, when you look at SARS, there was a moment when it was on the verge of collapse or being captured, as the Nugent Commission indicated. But you have seen a recovery in that same space. You also have a whole range of other reforms that are taking place. But what is also clear is that the same state has been weakened and has been eroding in other areas such as your local government. It has been weakened in areas such as your traditional leadership, which presents a dual authority at a local level. I know that Prof. Zabeza speaks quite extensively on that particular topic. I won't dwell on that. It has been weakened in terms of the fighting of corruption. Yes, we do have the commissions of inquiry. Yes, we do have policy proposals, but the state itself has been very weak in following through and implementing. All indications are that we may not and we will not meet the targets of the National Development Plan, precisely because either we procrastinate or there's lack of decisiveness in implementing some of the decisions. One of the reasons which has led to this weakness is precisely because what used to be a majority party for the longest time since the transition, the ANC, started experiencing its own internal factional battles. And these became even individualized. It then fragmented the party itself and it lost its strategic trust as the leader of society because of these infighting or the patronage networks that seem to have fossilized within its own ranks. But as it were, and as it is the case throughout the world, once you have a proportional representative system, especially the one with such a low threshold for entry as the one in South Africa, it always produces a fragmentation in the results of elections. And in most instances, it produces the coalition arrangements, which we have now seen. It started in 2016 in local government, and we are beginning to see that at a national level, at a provincial level, on a wider scale. And the projections of this fragmentation are still there. Therefore, if you are to strengthen the state, one of the reforms in terms of professionalizing our politics and also regulating coalitions would have to be factored in. And also, the building of state capacity in the main rests with the reforms that are effected in the public sector. That capacity of your bureaucracy or of your administration is the one that gives wings to political principles, where if you have an ethical, meritocratic in terms of the institutions. But what we seem to have done in South Africa is to build some of the best institutions, but we have not invested in the individuals who are occupying those positions to see who is occupying this, who is going to make sure that this is a program of an administration can be implemented. Belgium, as we all remember, because of coalition government disagreements, stayed for more than 2 years without any government. But because their bureaucracy was solid, because it was anchored, it was professional, they were able to receive services during that period to a point where some people were beginning to wonder when government finally settled down and they came with a coalition arrangement, they started wondering what difference does it make at times. So in the South African situation, the weaknesses that we have identified are the weaknesses in terms of institutions. They are fragmented, and also there are no filters to get ethical individuals in. And discipline management has always been very poor. And you have had some of the individuals who have been on suspension for 8 years, for 10 years, for 12 years. And also you have had individuals who are appointed, and when they are expelled in one province, they reappear in another province to be appointed again. And some even get promotion and end up being DGs or HODs. For one of the few countries where you fail upwards because of the systems which are very poor in filtering those. But what is not talked about, which needs more support as one of the key takeaways, is the fact that the current reforms of professionalization of public service, the current reforms of giving more autonomy and more power to the Public Service Commission, the current reforms which are delineating the roles between administration and politics, and the current reforms are to be supported. If we are to implement those, we will go some way in strengthening the institution of the state, because the state itself has become weaker. And at the time of coalitions, that's when you need to have a strong state in place. So I would simply say that this particular publication invites us to look at some elements of the South African state. And that in itself, I think it's something that we should be looking forward to the presenters who will begin to tease out some elements of this state and the direction it is taking. But one of the key challenges in the South African state is the leadership. It's not having national interest identified clearly in the simplest possible form. Even in the NDP and in other planning, whenever South Africa meets, the priorities rise to 100, 117, and so forth. But most countries which are serious about statecraft, they will have 4 or 5 key focal areas, and they will they will mobilize resources for those areas because they understand them, one, to be key to the national interest, but also key as catalyst which would turn the situation around. But that needs leadership, and that needs coherent leadership. But on top of all these challenges that I've raised, we should resist the temptation of trying to solve the problems of the past when you are also looking at the emerging trends, such as your geopolitical volatility and conflicts, which are punctuating the whole world and shifting so many other things, the trade wars that you are beginning to see, the arms race and the weaponization of technologies which used to be commercial. The other trend is the global warming environmental crisis, which has brought in frequency of disasters. Therefore, meaning that the state itself must begin to recalibrate itself and design disaster resilient institutions and continuity mechanisms. You also have the AI-driven technological revolution, which has evolved from your simple AI into your generative AI, which is projected to go into smart AI. And this is a double-edged sword. It can help with efficiencies, with policy planning, with data management, with monitoring of the delivery of services. but it can also hurt if you are not prepared, you have no AI plan in place, because fraud will come through this, cyber crime will come through this, and the attack of your systems will come through this. And the question is, fragmented as we are as a country, where we do have this impulse of being federal, confederal, and unitary at the same time, would we have the agility and common purpose to do that? And the other one of the mega trends, which every part of the world is grappling with, is the surge of migration and immigration management crisis. Migration and immigration itself is not a crisis, but how it has been managed, how it has been weaponized, has become a crisis. That's why across the Americas, you see the clampdown across Europe and so forth. And these pressures will start looking at the points of vulnerabilities. South Africa is not one of those countries that is doing very well in terms of the management, of this particular space. And when we talk of management here, you don't mean excluding people, but how you manage and know who is there. Whether they are migrating, inward migration from a village to a city, or migrating from another country to South Africa, that in itself, I think, a sophisticated state that is serious about its own statecraft normally has better ways of handling that. And of course, inequality, youth unemployment, and intergenerational poverty is one of those key mega trends which are defining not only South Africa, though South Africa has exaggerated forms of those precisely because of the weakness of state. I think I will conclude by simply saying this state of South African state is complex. It cannot be answered by looking at easy answers or asking simpler questions. And that complexity accommodates both the areas of renewal and the areas of decay. It also is a symptom of the fragmented system because we do not have consensus within the South African key role players on what the past was like, what the present experience is like, and what the future should be like. And you'd need a far more coordinated, a far more synchronized approach if the state capacity is to be unleashed and it can fulfill the promises of democracy which are outlined in our constitution. I thank you. Program Director, I hand over to you.
I hope you heard what I said, but if not, we'll have a telephone conversation. But I was thanking you for taking us through the complexities and the challenges of the state and in the kind of detail that you have. Thank you for spending the time with us this morning, and we wish you well for the rest of the day. The next person we have on the program is actually going to do a welcome from MISTRA and I'd like to invite Professor Willenkomo, who is the chairperson of the Board of Governors of MISTRA. He's online as well, and I wonder if we can just project him so we can all see him. I'm going to just introduce him as the board of the chairperson of the board.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you so much. This is wonderful to see MISTRA tackling quite a topic, a timely topic. I want to thank Joel Nachitendi, the staff, and everybody, and the board for creating an opportunity of this kind. Professor Samatata Fikeni, you outlined very important issues. Let me also add a little bit to your presentation, but I'm not going to be as detailed as we are. I think it's important for us to revisit the work of Aaron Wildowski on the art and craft of policy, speaking truth to power. I think this is the kind of work which makes us all to understand better as to where we're going. The art and craft of policy making, speaking truth to power. I was fascinated by the title of the book, The State of the South African State. MISTRA, you are creative. You have a way of making South Africans to feel comfortable. You are also educational to your world. Let me quickly recognize a number of distinguished guests. The Honorable Minister Ramakgopa, we thank you very much for being present. We recognize you and appreciate the contributions you are going to make to this important presentation or debate or discussion. I want to also thank Deputy Minister Andries Snell. You have always been with MISTRA and you have confidence in MISTRA and you continue to make significant contributions. Let me continue to recognize Ms. Mavuso, the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. A partnership with Business Leadership South Africa is very critical for us because we believe that the public sector and the private sector and think tanks like ours must work with entities like Business Leadership South Africa. This is the only way in which we can build a successful South Africa and a successful state. I want to also recognize Chief Malachi. We welcome your participation. You know, leadership is not only from one side, from politics. Leadership from chiefs is also very critical. It gives a sense of direction because people still believe in chiefs and we can't underestimate that important role. Allow me now to read only two CVs, short CVs, which are very critical so that people can understand who are the people who are participating in this important endeavor. Minister Ramakgopa, please allow me to read out your CV. You are in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. You have been minister for quite a while in South Africa's minister in the presidency for planning, monitoring and evaluation. You are a seasoned politician, a diplomat. You have served as Consul General in Mumbai, advisor and special advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa, and chief advisor to the AU and chairperson. You hold qualifications in business, management, and public administration, and currently you serve as the NC's second Deputy Secretary General. The second person, as I promised that I'm not going to be long, is Dr. Mpho Malachi, a respected traditional healer and traditional leader from the Malachi clan of Palaburu. You serve as a member of the National Council championing the integration of traditional knowledge and modern governance. Dr. Malachi, you are also a community mentor and advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let me just say three things. The title on the state for the South African state speaks for itself and already sets the tone for triangulation on the issue at hand. It takes a lot of courage to have a dynamic think tank like MISTRA to tackle such a complex matter. A title of this kind immediately inspires curiosity on governance matters. It also allows for further inquiry or inquiry. So I really want to thank you all, the participants, for having taken time to be part of this important endeavor. I now hand over to the chair. Thank you. Or the person who's chairing this session.
Thank you, Prof. Willem Kolmo. We do have Minister Ramaphosa online, and she will be doing an address to us at this time. So if we can get the minister on screen.
Okay, I'm here. Good morning, and thank you very much, Chairperson, for the opportunity that you have afforded us to actually just do this address. Let me also thank MISTRA, of course, for this opportunity to allow us to come and share our view, and also congratulate you, of course, on this publication. Let me take this opportunity to greet you, Program Director, and also, of course, greet Chairperson of MISTRA, Professor Sibusiso Vilinkomo, who just spoke to us right now. Let me also greet the Executive Director, Mr. Joel Netitsenze. Let me greet Deputy Minister Nell, and also greet Ms. Mavuso, the leader of BLSA, and also take this opportunity to recognize Chief Malachi, Dr. Chief Malachi, I'm not sure, or maybe Chief Dr. Malachi, I'm not sure how to really call it, but I will acknowledge you as such. Let me also take this opportunity, of course, to also greet the authors and the contributors to this publication or State of the South African State. Let me also greet Professor Fikeni, who had just addressed us earlier on and gave us an insight of the understanding of what they believe the state is, where we are supposed to go, what we should put in place to be able to deal with some of the constraints that have not allowed us to be able to move forward as we were supposed to. The members of the community of researchers and policymakers that are here, I'm also greeting you, and of course, other members of business and civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and I've already thanked, of course, MISTRA for giving us this opportunity. Of course, this publication adds to the knowledge base that exists in the country, which is quite important, and will be an important reference point in the implementation of reforms and plans as we build a capable, ethical, and developmental state. Our program director, last year we went to China to try and go and learn more about how to actually reform our SOEs. We also went to other countries, of course, in the global north. And one of the things that we learned, for example, in China, is that it took them almost 40 years to actually introduce the reform and master them through trial and error to be where they are today. But the good part about us is that we can just also take some of their learnings that they have made or understanding that they've made through the process that they've gone through to be able to implement them in our country as we try and build a developmental state. I commend MISTRA for once again convening the best of our thinkers to critically engage with the state of our nation, not only to convene conversation, but to drive our continued efforts towards social transformation. MISTRA is a crucial part of South Africa's intellectual architecture. Through its research, publications, and dialogues, it has kept alive the discipline of reflection that must accompany the practice of governance in our country. In this regard, MISTRA has dared to ask questions such as this one: what kind of state do we have? What kind of state do we need? And definitely, how do we build the bridge between the kind of state we have and the kind of state that we need? These questions lie at the heart of what we in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation frequently grapple with. Program Director, the title of this publication, State of the South African State, is both descriptive and diagnostic. It invites us to reflect honestly on the nature of our democracy 3 decades after 1994, where we got, of course, our freedom. It also invites us to reflect on the progress that we have been able to make and the fissures that threaten our cohesion. This is an important reflection that we undertook in our comprehensive 30-year review of South Africa's democracy between 1994 and 2024. It was published last year in April. The publication by MISTRA provides an additional resource and scope for collaboration in setting our nation on the path to achieve an inclusive growth, to create jobs, and to enhance the state capacity that we need to be able to intervene where necessary. Indeed, much has been done in the country during the course of our democracy. For example, we've built constitutional democracy admired across the world. We have also established institutions of accountability, expanded access to education, health, and housing, and created a robust framework to fiscal management and development planning. Yes, we have introduced all these interventions and institutions that are supposed to be able to move us forward, but maybe we can talk about, are they effective the way that they are supposed to? Of course, as I've already said, we also have to be frank to ask ourselves those kind of questions so that we can then now be able to align the transformative agenda that founded our state and our nation in 1994. Too often, the machinery of the state has been weakened by fragmentation, policy incoherence, and uneven capacity. This has resulted in the state's developmental promises being partially fulfilled and not fully realized. And I think Professor Fikeni did allude to that in some of the things that he has spoken about in his keynote address. As MISTRA's work reminds us, the crisis of state is not only a question of corruption or inefficiency, but of capability or purpose. It is about whether our intentions are agile enough and our leadership bold enough to drive structural transformation in an ever-changing world, but most of all, coordination that is needed and partnerships that are necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely why our department exists. It exists to strengthen the state from within, or it's supposed to do so. Our mandate is to ensure that policies and strategic priorities translate into tangible outcomes in people's life. We do this by doing a few things, and I'll just mention them. For example, the midterm and long-term planning that we have of our country, that embodied the National Development Plan, which is a Vision 2030 of the kind of South Africa that we would like to live in. Of course, there have been a number of issues that have been raised, but also a number of contestations of whether this would be a policy or a vision. We believe that as much as it is a vision, it's also a policy, because we derive everything else that we bring upon, whether it's midterm or short term, based on it. But we also have recently, from last year, introduced medium-term development plan of 2024 to 2029, which is a policy of this 7th administration. Professor Fikeni has alluded to the fact that we have a number of priorities that have been guiding our policies from let me say, from 1994. However, last year, we then now realized, after having gone through a number of processes, that we need to then now have at least only 3 priorities that will guide this 7th administration, based on, of course, the manifestos of the 10 political parties that are actually making the GNU, but also in driving forward the NDP itself. And those are 3 priorities at the moment, are actually the policy statement that is driving all government plans, from APPs to strategy plans, in terms of what we need to do. So I do believe that somewhere, somehow, we are getting there. Of course, we also have performance monitoring and evaluation, which tracks whether government programs achieve their intended impact. We have moved away from looking at just the output, but also now we are looking at the outcomes, the impact. If you say that you have built 20 hospitals, let me give an example, we would then now have to check the impact of those hospitals in their localities. So the monitoring and evaluation in terms of performance of government has also been changed in a way, but also the coordination and institutional strengthening by identifying systematic weaknesses and definitely coordinating responses across government, not only across government, but also partnerships with private sector. During the course of South Africa's G20 presidency, we also chaired the Development Working Group, which discussed and promoted a range of issues directly affecting developing and low-income countries. We advanced the cause of the African continent and the global south in the DWG, as seen in the landmark outcomes of this year's G20 ministerial meeting that happened actually in Skukuza. Of course, we included things like the 2025 G20 ministerial declaration that spoke to also 3 outcomes and called for action for universal social protection systems and social protection flows, as well as a call to action on combating illicit financial flow, as well as a chairperson's statement on global public goods, proposing the establishment of Ubuntu Commission to take forward the work undertaken during the course of the DWG of South Africa's G20 presidency on the emerging principles of fostering international cooperation for the protection and delivery of global public good. Of course, we agreed upon this precisely because there is an attack, as we all know, on multilateral institutions globally. So we really did believe that if we have to talk about AI, if we have to talk about dealing with or preparedness for diseases that we didn't know of, like pandemics, or even disasters that we continuously face because of climate change, we believe that there has to be some way, somehow, a way in which we do things as a united global force with, of course, differentiated responsibilities, but common goal of ensuring that we deal with the things that are actually necessary. And we did this precisely because there's also a lot of questions that are being asked, and we see a regress as well as it remains to the issues of funding for development globally, the ODAs, the overseas development assistance that we have always had, and it had a threshold, but now we see a lot of regress. Therefore, we did believe that we need to find a way to actually come up with work that may not actually yield any fruits today or tomorrow. It may take some time, but to continuously bring forward the issues of global way of doing things will definitely assist us. And we've had a number of countries, including the World Bank, that had said that they would like to partner with us, not necessarily partnering with us, but the DWG groups to be able to take us forward. Of course, next year, USA is taking over. We are not sure if they would like to continue with what we have put in place, especially as it relates to development. However, there are a number of countries like Germany and France, and of course, other multilateral institutions that would like to take this particular matter forward. In this sense, of course, DPME's work is a practical expression of what MISTRA calls for in the publication, the renewal of state capability and purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, the project of building a capable and developmental state is a political and a moral project. It requires a restoration of trust between the state and society, ensuring ethical leadership and create institutions that serves all of society and not just a few. And I think Professor Somadoda did speak to some of those issues that needs us to be able to improve, coordinate better so that we can then now be able to yield fruits that can be tangible and valued by society. Today, we are experiencing a shifting global context where climate change, technological disruptions, inequality and conflict are reshaping how states function. For South Africa to thrive, our state must become more anticipatory, more coordinated, and more citizen-centered. We must continue to rebuild a professional public service grounded in merit, performance, and a shared sense of purpose. That becomes quite important. We must also enhance the integration of institutionalizing of planning across all spheres of government, ensuring that every rand spent is aligned with the developmental outcomes. And we are already starting to see that happening as we have been able to adopt the MTDP. We had ensured that the province, when we discussed it, as well as some big cities, become part of our discussions, and also Salga was there. We did that precisely because we wanted to make sure that coordination within the spheres of government becomes crystallized, because it would not help that we would have a plan nationally and then the province would have its own plan, municipalities would have its own plan that is not necessarily aligned. We do this, of course, with the understanding that we still operate within a sphere of a constitutional legislative atmosphere where we have to, of course, respect all the other legislations that are there so that we can always operate within the law. However, coordination becomes important, most especially because we have already put in place what is called the DDM, which is supposed to bring us to having a one plan from all spheres of government, including what business is doing and academia is actually doing. Yes, we haven't been able to see some of the initiatives that we have put in place yielding the fruits that we wanted at the time and effectiveness that we needed. However, we are seeing progress, and we really do believe that through this coordination and through partnerships, including discussions such as this one that we're having here today, would then now be able to see fruits before the end of this seventh administration. Of course, Program Director, one of the enduring lessons of our democracy is that governance cannot thrive without knowledge, and knowledge cannot fulfill its purpose without governance. Institutions such as MISTRA are essential partners in the renewal of the state and in our endeavor to build a capable, ethical, and developmental state. Therefore, we must deepen the interface between the state and our knowledge community. Together, we can reshape a state that is responsive, accountable, and definitely transformative. Recently, we have gone to meet with Ms. Mavuso's team, precisely because we are developing a dashboard, or we have already been able to develop a dashboard that can help us to track not only performance of the state, but how the reforms that are put in place are actually working. We want to, or we would like to partner better with private sector, because they already have indicated that they are also tracking, because without data that is necessary for investment to actually come into South Africa, we won't be able to reach some of the agendas that we're putting in place, including the priorities that we have put in place in the MTDP, such as the one that would help us to industrialize and be able, of course, to create jobs. We're doing this because we do believe that active citizenry that we have seen in countries like India happening in such a way that it has been able to make the state become functional, from think tanks doing their work as it relates to informing policy, and private sector also coming on board to direct and also at least inform some of the decisions that are taken. So we are expanding that, and the coordination of the entire or the whole of society approach becomes important, so that when we evaluate ourselves or we evaluate the performance of government, we don't only do it in abstract, but we do it in understanding that indeed the nation and society have to work as one. In conclusion, Program Director, as we launch the State of South African State, we're invited here to actually be able to be part of. We're doing so to reflect on where we are, but to also reimagine where we could be. Let this publication be a mirror that reflects our challenges with honesty, and a map that guides us towards renewal and transformation. Our task in government, academia, and business, and indeed all of society, is to ensure that the South African state is one which is trusted instrument of collective progress, a state that listens, learns, and leads with integrity, thus shaping a just and prosperous future. Thank you very much, Program Director, for giving me an opportunity to just share my thoughts and the thoughts of the department as it relates to this publication. Thank you very much.
Minister Ramakgopa, thank you very much for spending the time with us. And I'm sure you would agree that was important to hear right from the heart of what we should be thinking about the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation. And Minister, thank you for your input. We're going to move now, and we are running a little bit behind time. So you will bear with us, and I'm going to look at the speakers here in front. I'm going to be very short on your introduction. Your pedigrees are all in the application, which we hope you will all get a copy of before you leave. There is a special price for the publication today. And if you buy after midnight tonight, you'll be walking out more and you won't be able to buy a copy for your friends. So I suggest that you get yourself a copy. I also just want to say that we have 120 people online who are following the conversation, and who are already beginning to post the questions for the discussion in the Q&A later on. We should mention that the CEO of BLSA could not be with us this morning, Ms. Busi Mabuso. And so we'd like to share her apologies with you before we go on. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we move to the heart of the book itself. And in this first session, still the next segment of the program is going to be an editor's overview, as you will see from the program. And it will then be followed by 3 of the contributors, authors who are have joined us today. We do have a few of the authors online. And of course, we have many of them participating. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask that Dr. Sandy Africa, who is the Director of Research at MISTRA, present the overview. She is going to be presenting on behalf of the 3 editors, but I would like you to tempted to ask you to stand, but to maybe just turn around and face the audience while Sandy comes up. Naim Gina, who is the Senior Researcher of Humanities at MISTRA. The editorial team has been very much of a collective, and I think we've benefited well from having 3 people oversee the research. Sandy, over to you.
Thank you, Gloria, and good morning to everybody. All the introductions and the welcomes have happened, so I'm just going to acknowledge everyone on screen, including Minister, the Chair, Professor Fikeni, the honored guests here, and say on behalf of all of us, the editors, and I think even the authors who will be speaking later and the discussants, all protocol observed. We now get into the part of our program where we talk a little bit more about the book. And the way we prepared our presentation is just to talk about the book as a research project, because this is essentially what it is the result of. Why there's Zoom. It must be. Oh, yes. Let's bring up a screen. On the screen. Yes. Yeah, on the screen. Sorry about that. So this is a research project that MISTRA launched several years ago. And the aims of this project were to examine the South African state, consider its functionality and effectiveness, focusing on events and trends that had become prominent since 2014. And when it wrote to us as editors, MISTRA said that it wanted to do this by commissioning and shaping a collation of contributions from leading scholars on the South African state. And of course, we are very, very flattered. I was at the University of Pretoria at the time. My colleague, Dr. Musa Nene, was at the University of Cape Town, and Naim had just joined MISTRA, I think, at the time. And yes, we were brought together as the editors of this edited collection. So the research project built on the work of earlier MISTRA projects, including those that you see listed there, essays on the evolution of the South African state, 20 years of democracy, so where to now, and the Indlulamiti scenarios, including the latest version, the macro social report, and other research which MISTRA has undertaken, looking at the South African state, nation building, and capacity needed to grow us. And the focus of this publication was going to be on state capacity, capability, and ethics. And the intention was for a transdisciplinary project that would really showcase that this is a complex issue, as Prof has said, which could be looked at from different angles. Sorry, again, I'm going to need you again, but I'm going to go on. So the research questions that we were, as a research team, expected to answer were the following. A core research question being, what is the current capacity of the South African state to make and implement effective public policy, conduct efficient and service-oriented governance, and effectively address the problems plaguing the state and the South African nation? And then there were a number of subsidiary research questions, including that of how far the post-colonial, post-apartheid state, some say the post-1994 state, I think the basis being that in a sense, perhaps we're just seeing a new apartheid, but how far has the state gone in meeting its objectives of overcoming the legacy of apartheid and transforming the erstwhile racist and exclusionary state? What are the manifestations of contemporary state failure, especially since 2014, and in particular, those related but not limited to state capture? And what are the effects of state weakness in South Africa? So a whole lot of questions, taking us up to the point of what are the possible reforms or interventions that could help strengthen the state and avert broader state collapse. And yeah, as you'll see, some of the chapters actually do talk about the kind of, make recommendations of what needs to be done. Okay, so the intention was for a book that looks something like this. If you have a copy, you'll see that in fact, the final product is very much like that which was conceptualized by MISTRA. Some framing chapters, some specific thematic issues, and a conclusion and a way forward. The process that we were going to follow, the tried and tested MISTRA process, we had received a concept note about the book. We were to convene a reference group who critiqued the concept note. There was a call for abstracts. Then on the basis of this, the identification of authors and chapters followed. And these chapter authors submitted their first drafts. There was feedback to them by the editors. Later, a double-blind peer review process followed. There were final revisions of drafts by the authors, and then the editing process, a rigorous internal editing process, but also followed up by our publishing partner, Jacana, followed, leading up to this point. So just to say that the structure of the book briefly is that there are 17 authors, including the editors. There are 17 chapters, and the book's about 400 pages long. Basically, there's a preface by the chair, an introduction by the editors, and the framing chapters. In the first instance, a kind of theory chapter conceptualizing state, followed by one on looking at the notion of the developmental state and developmental planning, followed by one on the economy and how the economy perhaps has been at the heart of some of the difficulties in actually capacitating the state to be able to do all the things that it needs to, but is exclusively implicated in the kind of weaknesses, complexities, failures, crises that the speakers before have spoken about. This is followed by, I'm just going to run through them because you'll see the book, because I know are going to buy a copy, what we call critical themes in the evolution of the post-1994 state. The book calls it the post-apartheid state, tax state and state capability, transformational leadership in the South African public service, state autonomy and state capture, the contested state and the just energy transition, the South African state's ability to govern water, traditional leadership in the era of multi-party democracy, and many others. I'll just run through them quickly. The state of the post-apartheid security service. There's a chapter, I must say, written by myself, but which presents perhaps a rather optimistic view given what we're hearing at the Madlanga and the parliamentary hearings. Gender and the state, very important. South Africa's policy in the evolving global context, and a chapter on the judiciary and democracy in the post-1994 context. Okay, and then this is followed by three contributions. The conclusion is short, but the two are very deep because they really go to the heart of the matter, reorganizing the state delivery machinery, and then civil society and the South African state. Brings up okay. So, I mean, the speakers before us have really been hit the nail on the head, so to speak, because the issues that they've raised are precisely what has come through in the research. And it's an edited collection, so each of the authors have their own perspective, theoretical kind of framing, and we tried to make all of this coherent. But what is interesting was what came through was the complexity. And so this crisis of the state has been deconstructed through the publication, through an evidence-based analysis. And what we find is that, yes, indeed, there's much cause for despair, but there's also cause for some hope. We've also seen that there's a history that has shaped and brought us to where we are. And it doesn't start with 1994. It has a colonial antecedent or precedent. But there's also a need to be future oriented when we look at the possibilities for the state. Some of the chapters debate what form state organization should take. Do we need strong central planning, or do we need to reconceptualize how the state is reorganized to meet its goals? But what's certain is that there's need for efficiency, sustainability, and quality, and not just universal access, as is so often said when things are rolled out. Increasingly, citizens are demanding quality services from our institutions. And among other issues that need to be addressed are the capacity and skills deficits, the fiscal pressures, certainly the degree of corruption, which has hollowed out state capacity and drained resources. And one of the chapters in the book really tries to grapple with this notion of state capture. So really strongly recommends that it be read by yourselves. Society's role in holding the state to account, both as a partner potentially, but also as a pressure point, is another issue. And then, of course, as Professor Kenny has alluded to, and so has Minister of South Africa's international role and the state's role as a multiplier for national development, and the therein is something else that we ought to be looking at. So, there are many policy recommendations that come from the different contributions, but if we pull out just a few, very obviously that the state is in trouble, institutions, and we're looking at the state not in a kind of template format, because we are only able to draw on elements of what public administration is doing, what parliament is doing, what judiciary is doing. It's not a kind of 360 overview of the state that a small publication of this nature is able to achieve. But certainly the message that comes through and the policy recommendations therefore are that Something's got to give. The state needs to be reorganized for better delivery and more effective delivery. And this includes strengthening the technical and institutional capacity, institutionalizing civil society engagement, building a stronger fiscal base and economy, leveraging international engagement, insulating the state from state capture, and of course, ensuring that we're going to promote ethical leadership on the part of those who are in state institutions. So fun is to reflect on the project as I conclude. This has been a great privilege as an editor, and I'm sure my co-editors feel the same way. It wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of MISTRA's partners, including and especially the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust, who gave us a grant to conduct this research project. So thank you to OMT. Subject matter, as we've seen today, was and it remains timely and relevant. We started in 2023 and we're still talking about the issues. I have to say that it was a collective and collaborative process, and it's not the editors by any means. That's actually the idea of the project predated the editors even being invited to launch or come involved. I say to MISTRA, and maybe now I'm saying it to myself because I'm in MISTRA, the timelines were very ambitious. The edit were commissioned in March, April 2023, and the intention was to launch the publish by February 2024. I think the idea was to launch it before the elections in 2024, but to MISTRA's credit, other work went on. There was a publishing of some of the research. There were seminars on the elections. There were other work going on. There was a seminar earlier this year. So there was a lot of work that was actually keeping the whole project alive. Okay, and I said the research could not possibly be comprehensive given the scale and magnitude of the state and its institutions. And so hopefully this is just the start of other iterations. We are ourselves thinking about whether we need to think about a state of the state too, where we'll continue to try to characterize the condition of the state and develop responses to it, develop the responses that are needed. Typos. And finally, to the MISTRA management team, the project reference group, some of whom are here and help to refine the concept. The authors, if the authors would please just stand, it would be so wonderful so people could see who you are, or just raise your hand if you're an author. The peer reviewers, you are the silent ones who got things actually, into shape, and many of you so generously gave into your time, of your time. I want to mention the project coordinator. He has to stand up. Please stand up. Maybe the authors haven't from a kid behind Jabulo, because he had a way of basically just persuading people to, to bear with us, because we needed a lot of bearing with in many ways. To our publications manager, Terry, where are you? Yeah, she's been great to really put this in. As I look this way, I saw Professor Suzanne Boyson. Well, this started under her watch as research director. So thank you, Suzanne. And Lawrence, another colleague who also started off project. So very much your work, which then just took over and ran with. And glad you could come and be here to share the fruits of your labor. The resource mobilization team and all the others at MISTRA who contributed to this project. It's really been a privilege and a pleasure to work on it. And from this point onwards, we're going to get into the actual substance, but we thought it important just to tell you about the book as a research project. So thank you for listening. Thank you.
Sandy, thank you for, on behalf of the editors, presenting that comprehensive overview and also sharing the process of how we came to have the book. So thanks to you for taking us through that overview. And we hope that as our audiences, you have had a good kind of background now to what is in the publication, and that in fact you're itching for us to complete so that you can go and get your copy. As they say on social media platforms, I am paid to say that. What I'd like to point out before we invite the authors to come up is that after all the publications, we do a policy brief, which is comes from the research and the different chapters. So there are copies probably on the book table outside. If you don't get a copy today, it's always on the MISTRA website. So one of the outputs is a policy brief. I'm going to very briefly introduce the authors who are with us today. Of course, there are many, as Sandy indicated, there were 17 authors, of which we have 3 here today. And so I'm going to introduce you very quickly all at once so that you come up and we don't have to spend more time in between. The first author we're going to call on is Mark Haywood. I'm sure you all know him. At the moment, I think he's the Justice and Activism Hub. He is a human rights and social justice activist. More of him is in the publication, if you'd like to know. Mark Haywood and Brian Levy did the chapter together. It's chapter 16 in the book, Civil Society and the South African State, Building a Capable, Ethical and Responsive State. So he's going to give us an overview on that chapter. Then he'll be followed by Stephen Friedman. If you have the book in front of you, it's chapter 14, Court of the People, Judiciary and Democracy in Post-1994 South Africa. He's going to give us an overview of that chapter. And then Masheti or Eddie Rakabe will follow with his chapter, Reorganizing the State Delivery Machinery. Reorganizing the State Delivery Machinery towards a Performing State. So if I can ask you, take us through the highlights of your chapters in perhaps 7 minutes. And the reason also for trying to squash the presentations just a little bit is to allow for more Q&A, which will follow the presentations. So Mark, over to you.
Good morning, colleagues, friends. First of all, congratulations to MISTRA for the publication of this very important book. And relevant to the chapter that I have co-authored, I think it's necessary to say thank you for including a chapter about civil society in a book that is about the state of the state. And the reason I think it's important is because in itself, it goes some way to recognize the role that civil society plays in shaping state continually in South Africa. And in certain respects, it's not unique to our country, but it's becoming more and more unique because as civic space shrinks around the world, as authoritarianism and populism grows in many countries it's the opposite. It is that the state seeks to shape civil society rather than civil society shaping the state. And I would argue, and this is why I think this book is to be one of the reasons to be commended, is that this issue of civil society, an incredibly broad term that we need to unpack, is itself something that needs more study and thought. including about how the interface and the interactions with different parts of the state. Usually, civil society is treated as something of an afterthought. You don't have schools of civil society like you have schools of business. You don't have schools of governance for civil society. And yet, civil society is important in a number of important respects, not just because civil society thinks it's important, and that's one of the problems sometimes with civil society, but because it's a large economic sector. In our country, there are 250,000 registered non-profit organizations with the Department of Social Development. I'm not sure how many people it employs, but it's a significant contributor to the development of economy, but also because it's an influential political sector. It's not a party political sector, but I think you can trace how civil society in almost every sphere of civic life contributes to shaping agendas. And very often, if you actually trace policy issues back, you find that they originate in a civil society think tank or in a civil society campaign. And one of the strengths of civil society is that its proximity to the community means that it is an early weather warning of particular issues. And if there was more done to integrate and to work with civil society, I believe it would contribute to a stronger state. But we still have a problem that although I think our country is more civil society friendly than many, many other countries, we still have a challenge of an antagonism between the state and many state officials and civil society. Suspicion, wariness, sometimes defensiveness, outright opposition. And I would flag that as something that needs more discussion, because the key point that we wanted to make in this chapter, and I'll finish with a couple of minutes on what's actually in the chapter, is that a capable state needs a capable civil society. And a capable civil society needs a capable state. And the two are critically related to each other. The capable state needs a capable civil society because civil society often brings agility, legitimacy, connectedness, the ability to import ideas and resources behind the role of the state. But civil society needs a capable state because civil society can have the best campaigns in the world around health, around education, around access to food. But if the state can't implement the fruits of civil society campaigns, then civil society becomes impotent at the end of the day. And it's certainly something that in my work in health, we see increasingly with HIV, which is what the chapter is in part about. Civil society was able to work with the state, and we've been able to roll out the biggest treatment program of any country in the world and prevent 6 million deaths. But in many other areas of health, state capacity is much weaker and is proving incapable of rolling out programs that are necessary to advance people's right of access to healthcare services. So what do we do in the article in conclusion? The article is co-authored by myself and Professor Brian Levy. It was the first time we worked together, a kind of activist and an academic, bringing different perspectives. It looks at two sectors, health and more specifically HIV, but also the education sector, where Brian Levy has done a great deal of work. And I think it makes an interesting argument to debate and to take forward, which is, it starts out by saying that in the last 30 years, a lot of activism, advocacy by civil society has focused on the demand side, in making demands of the state about programs. Whereas more advocacy now needs to focus on the supply side. But as I was saying a second ago, you can make demands till the cows come home, But if the state is unable to supply what you are demanding, then those campaigns will have limited impact. So the essence of the argument is in some ways for a shift in civil society thinking and approaches, not to give up its independence, but to work in a more coalitional way with the state and with parts of the state, and identifying supportive parts of the state to build coalitions to roll out the rights and the services that are promised to people in our constitution. And there isn't time to expand on that, but one of the things that struck me in writing and researching that article about the TAC, the Treatment Action Campaign, was that, you know, we were, I think, seen as something that was very confrontational at all points in our campaign for access to antiretroviral treatment. But I think the success of the rollout of the antiretroviral treatment depended a lot on the fact that underneath the confrontation, there was constant interaction with people and places in the state, and attempts to demonstrate to the state that a program such as the antiretroviral program could work. And there isn't time to expand on it, but it lifted the morale and the sense of possibility of healthcare workers and people who worked in the state. So I want to finish just by saying that's the essence of it. My conclusion is that just as we're here to introspect on the state, there's no doubt that civil society needs its own introspection. At the moment, the world, as we've heard in the introductions, is changing dramatically. Civil society strategies and methods and tactics that worked very well 20 years ago or 10 years ago do not work very well now. And there's a need to reorient, to rethink, to build new alliances, to build new coalitions, indeed, in some ways, to completely reconceptualize. Because as Sandy said, and this is my last point, on the slide that was just put up here now, civil society's role in holding the state to account is crucial. But the argument that I would make is that civil society's role goes way beyond just holding the state to account. That is a part of civil society's role. And in fact, it is much more thoroughly captured in this policy brief, where there are 4 recommendations that are made about institutionalizing civil society engagement. So the question is, how do you change your spots, but at the same time maintain your independence and your integrity in joining with the state in a bigger political project to realize the South African Constitution? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm the second guy. Look up the name. I note I have 7 minutes. I assume these are academic minutes. Appreciated. Academic minute is 20 human. Yeah, seriously, congratulations on the book. And I think it's interesting. I mean, it maybe was an oversight that when Dr. Africa put up the list of the initial design for this book, the judiciary wasn't there. Okay. And the reason I imagine the judiciary isn't there, the point I make in the article, is that people in this country talk, and probably other countries too, talk about the state. They don't think about the judiciary at all. You have people saying, well, the state's a mess, but the judiciary would. But it's kind of, you know, political theory 101 that the judiciary is a very important part of the state. So if you say, you know, if you hold that view, what you're saying is you don't think government is working well, but the judiciary is working well, which means that one aspect of the state is working and another aspect of the state is not working. Now, not only is the judiciary an aspect of the state, but I argue in the chapter that in many ways it's one of the state's most important assets. But it's a double-edged sword. It's both an asset and a liability. And best way to explain that which I do in the book to a certain extent, is to put this in the context of an analysis of what's been happening in this country for the last 30 years. Because I think one of the problems, the sort of big picture problems, is, I've been listening very carefully, people, these sort of query sweeping statements about who the state works. Does the state work well or does the state not work? And I think in most societies, but particularly this one, you'll find that the state works a lot better for some people than it works for other people. And that needs to be unscrambled. It's obviously there's a lot of complexity which this overlooks, but my rule of thumb for understanding responses to the South African state is that the people who it works best for are the people who complain most about it. And the reason why the people complain who it works best for complain most about it, there's some other complicated reasons which relate to our colonial history, etc., which I won't go into, is about the nature of the change process over the last 30 years. And in a nutshell, and if I could put one sentence on my own, all this is a book I wrote called Business of the Past, which is available from all reputable. But the argument of the book is essentially that we changed our political system in 1994, but we didn't change a whole lot else. And one of the, for the purpose of this discussion, perhaps the reality we didn't change, which is most important, is the society's division between insiders and outsiders. So that before 1994, I had an outsider division, and I see Dr. Mbetti's there. She's heard this 100 times. Sorry, it's my gig. You get your chance. The reality is that you don't, and there's a whole lot of theoretical stuff in the book about it, you don't change your society purely by changing your political system. And the one division which persists is that between insiders and outsiders. And very, very crudely put, the insiders in this country are anybody who derives an income from the economy. In other words, if you get a wage or a salary or a dividend or profits or whatever, you are inside. And obviously that means that insiders range from the CEOs of the major banks to the women who clean their offices. So there's a lot of inequality within the insider group. But this is important because I would argue very strongly that all politics in this country is insider politics. All the voices we hear are insider voices. And we do not hear outsider voices. Outsiders get to vote, but are then not part of the conversation in between elections. And this is important to the judiciary because the judiciary has a very high degree of legitimacy among the insiders. A remarkable amount of legitimacy given all the disenchantment in this country about the state of our democracy and the state of our legal system. So that, and legitimacy, of course, doesn't necessarily, if you say an institution is legitimate, you don't mean that everybody loves it. You mean that everybody recognizes its right to take the decisions that it takes. And the legitimacy is very high here because decisions are accepted. There might be foot dragging when it comes to implementing them, but that doesn't alter the legitimacy question. And there is a fairly widespread belief among the insiders that the system serves people very well, which to a large extent it does. And that is obviously a huge asset because you can't maintain a functioning democracy without an effective judiciary. On the other hand, there are reasons to question whether the outsiders have quite the same enthusiasm for the judicial system as the insiders. And of course, one of the problems about talking about what the outsiders want or don't want is that they don't get to speak. So it's usually guesswork. But I think there's a lot of observed reality, and I talk about this in the chapter, in the way people react to the judicial system. So just one very clear example, which illustrates that, is that, I mean, we all know that one of the blights in this country are very high levels of violence in the areas where poor people live. very often directed at women and children. And you tend to find, for example, that when somebody is arrested for one of these acts of violence, there is an immediate large numbers of people from the area turn out, and there's a very clear assumption that whoever was arrested is guilty, and that this process of having to listen to the evidence is really just getting in the way of getting justice for the person who was violated. I think there are pretty clear indications around about the insider scale, the people who are not part of the conversation, that at the very least, although they don't arrive holding banners saying we're uncomfortable with the judiciary, that they're not convinced that this institution actually works for them. Whether their perception is right or not is not. And I think if we look at some aspects of the judiciary, we see that as important as it is also to a certain extent a symptom of the problem rather than an antidote. And I'll just very briefly sketch out some of the ways in which this is true. So the way in which it is most obviously true is that as important as it is, the judiciary, like many institutions in this country, is also an inequality. It also reinforces and in a sense strengthens inequality. And it does this, of course, because it's tried to point out that some people can afford justice and other people can't. If you're at one end of the spectrum, you arrive with batteries of lawyers and implement something called the Stalingrad strategy going over years. If you're an outsider, your chances, and let's be quite frank about this, your chances of justice in this country depend on you making contact with a donor-funded NGO. Okay, if you find a public interest law firm which is prepared to take on your case, then you might get justice. Otherwise, you are excluded. So immediately there's the justice system legitimacy is also a problem for our political system. It's also a problem for democratic politics in this country. And the reason it's a problem for democratic politics is that it has become a crutch. And the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, who a very important judicial thinker in this country, made this point very forcefully in the last period before he stepped down. And he said that if people did not stop bringing every single political dispute to the courts would be unable to handle the process. Certainly in a constitutional democracy, the courts have to protect democratic politics, and I talk about this to a certain extent, but they're not supposed to substitute for democratic politics. And I think that there are tremendous pressures on them from the political parties and from political actors of all sorts. The ANC is still the biggest party. When ANC people have a fight about branches, they go to the courts. They expect the courts to settle. It's not just, the opposition tends to do this because it compensates for the fact that the majority of people don't vote for you. But it's pretty much across the whole. And then, of course, something which becomes sort of part of the South African reality, but which I think is very much a part of the problem. Is that the judicial system in this country is painfully slow. Very often there are these kind of, these people who say, well, why aren't they all in red jumpsuits, etc. Well, one of the reasons they aren't in red jumpsuits is it takes you about 2 years to start leading the evidence in between all the points of procedure, etc., which get in the way of actually trying to resolve. So, in a nutshell, I'm suggesting first is that as important as the judiciary is, like every other institution in the country, it needs to confront the fact that it is at the moment serving 1/3 of the population, and that besides the obvious point that this is inequitable, it is also in the longer term unsustainable. I don't mention this so much in the chapter, but I think it's worth mentioning we are entering a new phase in politics in this country, and one of the consequences of these new developments is that all manner of assumptions which were not questioned over the last 30 years are now going to be questioned. And a lot of those assumptions are assumptions which those of us who believe in democracy think are very important. So the assumption that democracy is a good, that equity is a good, that equality is a good, is going to come under pressure. And if the courts are unable to deal with this because they don't have legitimacy, then the problem is going to be tremendous. And my final point, because I'm sure I've run out of academic words as well as human, is that we really do, across the board, the political class, the people who comment on it, etc., we really have to understand that the job of a court in a constitutional democracy is to make democratic politics possible. And I mentioned there, taking it out of the realm of political parties, a very interesting debate, and I'll close with that, over the question of what the role of the courts are in disputes about social and economic rights. Because what has happened over the last few years, there is tremendous pressure from legal academics, etc., for the courts to say, well, this is what a social and economic right means. You're entitled to 12 kiloliters of water or so much electricity or whatever, and we as a court will determine that. And the legal academics love that because then they can be the people who decide what everybody else's life should be. And what the Constitutional Court has done over the last is, instead of doing that, has said to the parties, you must negotiate. You must negotiate the way in which that is done. And I think that's precisely the attitude that I'm talking about. That is an attitude which reinforces democratic politics, because it says to people, you get to decide. But there's a but to that. The role of the courts is to strengthen democratic politics, and that means that in a context, it's the job of the court to make sure that people really have that opportunity to negotiate, because there are all sorts of power imbalances, all sorts of inequalities. And if you simply put a group of homeless people in the same room with a bunch of powerful people, you know what's going to happen. So you have to make sure that the homeless people have the kind of judicial support they need in order to negotiate on an equal footing. And I think because our concern has to be 2/3 of the society who are excluded, I think that example is a very good idea of the way in which the judiciary can strengthen democracy in the period. Thank you.
What important are we? Yes, yeah. But other guys, they can have it.
We see just
So the chapter that I was doing in the book focus on the interface between administration and performance. You know, when I was writing this chapter, I think we really trivialized the role of public administration and its responsibility for some of the things that are happening within the state. And I was writing the chapter, I remember just how much I hated administration and the force when I was doing my economics. Thought to myself, why am I even doing this course? Telling me about whereby and all the different really struck my mind when I really got to engage with this chapter about the performance and administration. Why is this important? I mean, we've had President Big recently, last year, I think, when he was attending the SAPHAM conference, he said a lot of these organizations' responsibility are increasingly being taken over by the private sector. When the traffic lights are not working, insurance companies come in and pick them. When the pothole discovery comes with another initiative to fix those potholes, suggests that there's some kind of failure within the delivery machinery. Task that is required by the public sector itself. And here, I really wanted to highlight the importance of organizational structure, the role it plays in making sure that the state performs its role best. And here we construe organizational structure not just as simple organizational charts, narrow charts, where the CEO, DGs, and the directors and stuff, but rather more broadly to get the structure of the state holistically, the branches of the state, really within the State Departments and the subunits within those, as well as the interface between these different substructures and the substructures between and within the different branches of the state and how they interface. We draw from quite a number of theoretical models I've just mentioned, from your Berlin model to public management to your new public governance. So these are the stories that we go from. And the problem, how we problematize the study is that we really find ourselves in the public sector, or the organizational public administration system, or the regime itself, is navigating conflicting public administration regime. Because when in 1994, we adopted a certain administrative regime that we had to change because it was a new, we had to embrace, democratic culture and stuff like that. So in that process, we find ourselves having to navigate all these conflicting administrative regime. Your very models. So these are almost like we move from a model where was very, when the state was instructing what to do, to where the state is trying to create partnerships between its own stuff. So almost trying to embrace different cultural regimes or cultural norms in the state itself, and as a result, there's that conflict. And how you see this? You see this in a way in which, during the reform process or the evolution of the reform of the public services, what has happened is that we had to integrate our national reconciliation and reconstruction goals with those of operationalizing and restructuring the civil services. So when this restructuring was happening post 1994, we've had to incorporate structures that came from before 1994 into the post 1994. And we assumed, as the system evolved, that those would then be embedded within the new structures that has been created. But because of the cultural DDTs, many of them have never necessarily reformed or adopted or embraced this new administrative regime that we wanted to, and that's where the juncture really happened. And really, I think that is really the center of this particular article. That's really the center of the problem as it relates to state performance. We attribute capacity or the inability of the state to perform to deficient structural organizational structure in the state. Why? Because you've got a myriad of delivery system or delivery structures that are dispersed and fragmented across a myriad of organizational systems. That creates fragmentations, it creates duplication, lack of ownership for result, blurred lines of responsibility. And we continue to see a number of initiatives within the state itself to try to address some of these problems, because they are not new. They've been happening since 1994, but we've been trying to, as the system evolved, there are a number of initiatives that are increasingly being introduced, especially from the Department of Public Services and the Service Commission. They continue to make recommendations as to how to address some of this really what I call systemic organizational. But we are failing because we are struggling. We're dealing with an embedded public administration culture. That's why we are unable to deal with some of those points through these reforms that have been introduced over time. And as a solution, because I thought, what do we do? Because these are not new problems, and from many people would agree that these are not new problems. What do we then do? Because we've had numerous recommendations. Every year, you've got the Public Service Commission coming with a report and say they've made an assessment of certain delivery mechanism or delivery system within a certain branch or within a certain department and make recommendations. But how then do you reorientate the entire delivery machinery so that the state itself can perform? Not necessarily create more confusion or create more tension. So I then went back to a very old commission that was set up by the Mandela administration. It was called the Presidential Review Commission on Reform and Transformation of Public Sector. It was headed by Dr. Mapaya, if I remember very well. I mean, that commission made a number of very good recommendations, which many of whom have been adopted, but there remains others, so many which have never really been taken on board, which I think would be very instrumental in reorientating the state in current form to make sure that it becomes a performing state. So what are some of the recommendations of course there are so many recommendations in the, but what are some of the recommendations which I think, or based on this article, we think may work, is the setting up of an organizational review agency within the department, within the presidency. It's an argument which is made by another chapter written by Chief in the book about this organizational review agency that should be established within the presidency. And its role is really to make ongoing review of the organizational structure within the system so that you deal with fragmentation as it happens, rather than waiting for a long time only to come back with recommendations. While at the same time, the system itself self-entrenches, because with every program, with every budget, the system self-entrenches. People create, enclaves within the system itself. Then it becomes very difficult to dissolve when you make when you want to duplicate duplication. And that's what this organizational review agency was really participated to do. They also recommended that there should be a procurement moratorium at that time, which I think, given the challenges we have with the magangas and stuff, it might be an important time to rethink whether you need that. We've also had on numerous occasions the presidency making statements about reviewing the number of the departments within the state, and these were the recommendations that were made then by this review commission. Among some of these departments they recommended should be phased out was the Department of Public Enterprise. I'm sorry if there's anyone. Not my recommendation. Not my recommendation. The reason was that the state-owned enterprises that report to the Department of Public Enterprise should report so ESCOM would report to Energy, Transnet would report to the Department of Transport. I think this I want to put it up. And lastly, not relate to him, Deputy Minister now, they said they don't see the reason why we should have too many.
Your case.
I mean, to complete I think I've read an article during the week which was Sikampu from. He make a very important observation about the delivery machinery. Says the state does not reform, it absorbs it. It speaks the language of renewal, adopts the posture of accountability, perform things and rituals, all while preserving the relationship that keeps it intact. What appears to be a rupture, often an act of repair, not of institutions, but of legitimacy. The system reforms not to transform, part to survive. Thank you very much.
Sure, you will agree that that was a really good insight into what those chapters are about. And if I were you, I'd start thinking what I'm going to buy Phoebe on the way home while I get to read the book overnight. By tomorrow morning, all the 17 chapters are down. Mark, Stephen, and Machete, thank you very much for focusing our attention on the key issues in the chapters. I want to just thank our guests online for still being there. We know you're there. We hope you are on screen and listening, but thank you for staying with us. And then thirdly, we're going to do a bit of a change in the program now. And I want to just back it up by saying we always want to engage people when we launch a book. We have the feedback from people who attend is always important to us. However, today we want to just do change over and go straight into the reflections that we have, and there are 3 of them that we're going to follow through with. So with your permission, we're going to just go straight into that, and then we'll spend the bulk of the time at the end of that to still engage with questions. I want to make a suggestion as well that over lunch, because we stop at 1 o'clock for lunch, that you spend time with the authors who have presented, but there are also a few around who haven't presented. Please speak to them directly and engage with your question and on today's presentations. And we're also noting the questions that have come online, and we do note them. We take them very seriously. So even if we don't address them in today's launch, we are aware of what your thoughts are and your feedback are. So this is the end of me and the session. Thank you for participating. I think I've made my point about the book and the policy brief. I'm going to hand over to Musa, who's going to be the program director for the next session. Musa, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Toria, for chairing our, or good afternoon. Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Thank you for chairing our first session. Once again, thank you to all the speakers who engaged in the first session this morning, setting out the scene of this incredible work and very timely work as has been already said this morning. With all protocol observed, of course, and thank you once again to the authors as well, who did an amazing job, and the team that worked together. Fitting that, of course, we should engage with this work, and any work with its substance needs discussants. So we do have very important discussants who will engage with this work. But perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Ruth, and I'm from the Nelson Mandela School of Governance at the University of Cape Town, and I direct the academic program there. And it's been such a pleasure to be a co-editor of this volume. Because we have moved straight into the second session, we also acknowledge that you might need to take some comfort breaks, so nobody will judge you when we see you stepping out. We are chasing the lunch and the book sales, of course. And then just a reminder to those that are online that you can be sending through your questions and comments while we are engaging. And please do remember to engage on the social media platforms that have already been stated by Gloria this morning. So we do have 3 discussants that will be engaging. I'm going to read their biographies at once, and then I'm going to ask that each of them will then come through one after other, beginning with Professor Mary Metcalf from the University of Johannesburg. Professor Metcalfe is a professor of practice in the School of Public Management, Governance and Policy, University of Johannesburg. She holds a master's degree in education from the University of the Witwatersrand. Metcalfe began her career in education in 1974 as a remedial teaching teacher. She has been involved in teacher education and anti-apartheid work, contributing to education policy development for the African National Congress. From 1994 to 1999, she served as the Provincial Minister for Education in Gauteng, was the head of the School of Education at the University of the Witwatersrand from 2005 to 2009, and she currently leads the program to improve learning outcomes, focusing on enhancing learning outcomes across the education system. This will be followed by Dr. Sithembile Mbete from the Public Affairs Research Institute. Dr. Mbete is the Executive Director of the Public Research Institute, a political scientist with over 15 years experience in academia, civil society, government. She previously lectured at the University of Pretoria. Her research focuses on elections, democratization, and public policy. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Pretoria. And then finally, we have Dr. Annette Grisol from the Public Policy and Development, who is a public policy and development consultant. She's a public policy and development consultant with extensive experience in government and strategic planning. She serves as Deputy Director General for National Planning Coordination at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Her work focuses on policy coherence, governance, and program alignment across government, and she's previously held senior roles in communication and governance in the Gauteng province. What I'm going to ask from the speakers is that perhaps they obtain their time to about 7 or 8 minutes, and that we will to recover the time and complete in time. So without any further ado, may I please welcome Professor Metcalfe to the podium, please.
So I should start with saying I don't have a very good voice at the moment. So if my voice gives up, I'll sit down. Firstly, I want to say I love the book. I've enjoyed everything that I've read. I've learned a great deal. I've been asked to look at some of the key themes and reflect on education. So reflecting on education is not meant to say that the problems are unique to education. They are an example of the themes. Because of time and because of voice, I'm going to just tell you what my 4 main points are. Then I'll come in and Abba will wave at me when I'm done. So the first point is that an issue for me. I'm going to use a phrase that Jonathan Jansen used, and I'm going to develop it when I speak to it. What we have is policy sprawl, implementation crawl. I want to further develop that by saying we've also got project sprawl and the failure to prioritize in relation to those projects, and I'll explain that. The second thing I want to look at is structural factors, going from, I think, both Joel and there's chapters about how important those structural factors are. The third thing is David Harrison once wrote an article. I love the title, but the title didn't do what I expected. I'll do what I wanted the title to say, because he had a chapter in a journal that was called The Soft, Hard Parts of Change. And I think there's several people who've addressed that in the chapters. And then the last one, which I hope to get to, is what I want to call the sprawl of what the center. So Joel and others use the concept of a pilot as the center. And it's almost like we've got not a pilot driving the plane, would never work if you want to get there safely. So those are my 4 main points. Now let me try and explain. I think firstly, in terms of policy, what we have are aspirational policies, which are not necessarily accompanied by what are the implementation steps over time and what extent are they resource bound. They remain as glorious internationally, stand up and be pleased with ourselves policies. Actually, many of these are not being implemented, and fundamentally, one of the main reasons is because it's not linked to the fiscal program. So we have ambitious policies to the fiscal program. I'm going to use 2 examples from education. I love the fact that Stephen insisted on the importance of the judiciary as a key component of the state. We all have a passion for our Concord, for the Constitution, for the Constitution. I can tell you that in education, in basic education, we have at least 4 or 5 Concord rulings instructing the state to implement what should be there as defining the right to a basic education. Concord rulings are simply ignored because there's no finances. So for me, and I'd love to get Stephen's comment on that, is it's so frustrating for society to be taking the state to court, to be winning the arguments on evidence, in it just to fall by the wayside because there's no higher power. Maybe the pilot. It's not implemented, it's just not there. I've tried to go louder. Please keep telling me. Yeah. So people at the back also help me, unless it's just voice. I want to use an example from post-school education and training. So in post-school education and training, we had a white paper in 2013, an implementation plan that was published last year for the white paper. The white paper itself said we do not have the resources to implement this plan. The implementation plan said when we wrote the white paper, we knew we didn't have the resources, and we still don't have the resources. So how can it be that without not a committee, but a pilot, is there somebody who's saying, have to pull this together without the capacity to implement? The second component that I think I want to talk to there is failure of leadership in terms of the difficult choices that are required in order for prioritization. At the ANC Ready to Govern conference, John Samuel was very brave. He said to civil society, he said to our stakeholders, partners, cannot afford 12 years of free and compulsory education. Have to have a GET, 10 years from grade R to grade 9. 10, 11, and 12 is not going to be affordable within the schooling system. So that architecture was created, but not followed in terms of, must I go louder? Yeah, thank you. You're my person. Just keep going. So I could talk more about that and of what we have now, which is a failure to provide strong leadership to the public, to the sector, which says education must solve the education and basic education must solve the education and training problems. Therefore, we need more skills in the FET sector, which is a proliferation of expensive training that duplicates what should be happening in DHET. There's nobody who's actually looking at this duplication, the fact that it's not affordable, exercising authority. So I'm going to go to structural factors. It's a race now between time and my voice. So firstly, in terms of structural factors, I'm going to say 4 things. Firstly, national and provincial
have not yet mastered, and I can use examples in education, of the complex relationship between national and province. We act in our behaviors as if it's hierarchical without sufficiently acknowledging the reality of concurrency. And I don't mean in constitutional terms of legalities. I mean in the way in which we take our MDTP, take our medium-term strategic plan, and then check whether the ambitions of the sector are implementable in the financial constraints of the provinces. That is a major issue which we won't have time to talk about. So the current, I have to say my time is over.
You're already a minute over.
Oh, I'm a minute over. So I'm sorry that I can't talk about the other things, but it's such an interesting book and it made me think about so many things that I'm going to have to. Where's my chair? There's my chair. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Professor, for those reflections. And now we welcome Dr. Mbete to the podium. Please let's go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am going to try and be very quick about this. And thank you so much, Professor Carr, for actually saying a bunch of stuff that I was going to say, so I don't have to say it now. But this is a really excellent volume, and there needs to be a part 2 because it ends with the immediate period of this GNU that we have now, but I think that there's a lot to be explored, both of the experience of the current governance arrangement that we have at national level, but also to really delve into and unpack some of the issues that are raised that have already been mentioned and alluded to here. And so I am going to speak about 2 things primarily. The first one is politics, which sort of lives as either the scary monster under the bed, sometimes the big shadow behind the chapters, and there's some of the chapters where it's deeply engaged with, which is really important. But that there's a lot around the functioning of our state, the state of our state, that is directly related to political failure or political dysfunction. And Prof. Friedman alluded to that earlier, that there's a lot that we diagnose as sort of state failure or administrative failure that actually has a lot to do with political dysfunction on all sides. And figuring out what to do around how we get to a functional politics is going to really be important for then enabling the states to function as it should. And then the second thing is, and my partner says this all the time, so he might be online, so he'll be happy that I'm quoting him with this: execution beats speaking English every day. And our state is really bad at execution. We're great at speaking. And so I will talk about that, and then that'll probably be my time. So the first thing on politics, there is so much. Can I borrow this quickly? I want to be able to speak about the chapter specifically. Is chapter 6 by Prof. Shanil Haricharan, but it's also spoken about in Abba's chapter that frames that gives the conceptual framing of the state, and it's mentioned in several others around how much of an impact politics, political decision-making, political interference into appointments has impacted on the functioning of the administration. And it's this puzzle that we are unable to solve. And unfortunately, a lot of the discourse on that in the court battles and the lawfare that takes place centers on cadre deployment, and you know what Zondo said about that, and there's been the DA taking the ANC to court for cadre deployment, and there's lots of focus on that, but there's a much more fundamental aspect of it, which is that the basic principles of what an capable administration is supposed to do for the technical stuff, because there's so much of statecraft that is basic. Clean the streets, fix a water pipe, organize a dinner in the diplomat, and my PhD was in international relations, the complications of like how you organize those kinds of dinners and things, those basic implementation things that are caught up in a lot of political power play, dysfunction within political parties and factional play, but also in the playing out of what should be fought at electoral level, but actually is poured out in the implementation of basic administrative functions of the state. And we've got a political party problem in this country. Phoebe's here. I've said it to Phoebe before, so it's not something I say behind her back. We've got a serious political party problem in this country that we try to then fix in all sorts of other ways, whether it's through the court system, where we ventilate, as Prof. Friedman has said, political battles through court cases, or whether it's using the tools of administration to either implement things or not implement things, or to favor certain people and not others, because fundamentally we're having a political fight. Now, the urgency of dealing with that, particularly acute, given that we are in coalition land, national, provincial, local. Prof. Boyson's research on coalitions shows that we, at local level, no matter what people say about how unhappy they are about coalitions, we had more and more coalitions at local level after each election. What we've seen at national level isn't going to change. There is not a single party in this country that commands the support of over 50% of the population. It doesn't exist. And because of the nature of the electoral system that we have, that means that the outcome of any election will lead to a hung legislature and by necessity a coalition. And until we figure out how to make the politics function, the administration is always going to be then collateral damage in political fights. And so when we think about insulating the administration from political, from politics, it's not just about, saving from state capture, or, and I work at Parry, which came, which publicized a lot of this language. Yes, it's about corruption. Yes, it's about maladministration and state capture, but actually fundamentally, it's how do you keep things ticking over? Well, the politicses, because we're a divided society. Politics is the good way for us to organize our conflicts with each other. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't impede our collective well-being, which is where we are at the moment? The second and last thing is that execution beats speaking English every day. And I taught at a university for many years. And one of the big criticisms, self-criticisms that we had was that we talk often, and Prof. Metcalf spoke about it, that, we've got good policies, but poor implementation. Good policies should be implementable. Our policies can't be all that great. And part of the problem is that when we teach policy making, we teach the English, we don't teach the execution. So what does it logistically take to get me standing here on this podium? There's a bunch of practical logistical steps that needed to be taken by a number of actors to get all of us into this room and some of us standing here. We don't think that way when we think about national politics. All the pretty words, but yes, cost is a factor. How much is it going to cost at each step? How many people is it going to take? What is each person supposed to be doing, and how do you know that you can move from this step to the next one? And that technical and logistical thinking around statecraft, that statecraft
craft is not policy making. It's execution, it's a doing. Lead engineers, I never thought I'd ever say that in my life. But you know, engineers, not political scientists, to be thinking out of these things. And then the final thing that's linked to the execution beat speaking English is that, and I think that this is an area that deeply needs to be explored, is that our state is effectively a contract manager. We have taken out the implementation capacity of the state and outsourced it. Langa is all about outsourcing. And then the mafia battles that come with that. And it's not unique to South Africa. We really need to think about what that means for statecraft and where we take our state going. Thank you very much.
Mission candidates.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have already been introduced, but just to note, I'm no longer in government. I'm currently a consultant and in government. I was. Just in case anybody, we need to look into this. Okay, but thank you very much. I have focused primarily on about the reorganizing machinery towards a performance. I must say that it's a very useful overview that is given, and it also, foregrounds a conceptual framework that is useful around the levels of resources, analytical, operational, political, and I thought that was very useful. I'm going to focus, and some of the issues have already been touched on by other speakers, and I think the themes are clear and they're emerging. Firstly, the issue of the public policy cycle. It's the fundamentals of everything we do as the state, including execution. I want to also just touch on public service system inefficiency, because we tend to look at the macro. Okay, let me just set this minutes. Who's the timekeeper? And then, also just touch on the issue of participatory governance, because, sometimes we in academia, and with all due respect to academia, we create ideas that have already existed for decades. And then we say, no, this is in NPM, new public management. We create a title with some of these ideas come from our struggle against apartheid as a country, but I'll touch on that if I have time. The issue of our analysis of the current situation, and obviously everyone's got their take, and many people have spoken about this, but for me, and I'm not going to go into the details, is that we are in a cycle of evolution. The problems compound, one problem compounds the other. So, we saw that with the power outages and so on. Leads to unemployment, that leads to a decline in public revenue. But if you look inwards, the poor perceptions of the public sector also lead to a brain drain sector. As someone mentioned, in the early days of our democracy and the heavy hitters with ministers, DGs, etc. I won't say anything about our current people. Measuring state performance, that's obviously what this is about. I don't really agree that there's an elaborate system of performance measurement. Yes, we've got APPs, NDP, MVP, etc. But the system of measurement is not appropriate in many cases. And I'll come back to that. And many of our reports are inward-looking. We get a clean audit rather than outward-looking. Not development indicators, but we don't link state capacity and state performance and state capability to what impact does it have on ordinary people. And I think we know all the issues that we should be looking at in terms of our development results. The public policy cycle, and I think many people have done this. DPME has its own version that is linked to some of the literature, and how the system should work across the state machinery, the issue of results-based management, M&E, adaptive management resulting in better outcomes, implementation science. Yes, we always talk about it, but we're not implementing it. Take it from me as an insider, a former insider. I was right there, and we don't implement our results-based approach. So we actually don't do that. Then why do programs fail? Yes, we English, but we don't execute. It's a lot more complex than that. Everybody often says, and we hear it every day. We have good policies, but we don't implement. What are some of the main reasons behind program failure? Number one is poor problem analysis. People will say, even if you take something like poverty, you'll find that very senior people in government don't understand poverty, even though they're supposed to be through their programs addressing poverty. So I'm saying the nature of the problem, the etiology of the problem changes over time. It's not the same as it was in 1989, that we are where we are today in 2025. So, and they also don't have a theory of the problem that results in poor program design. So a program is designed to address something which is not the appropriate analysis of the problem. Poor theory of change. And I know that if your theory of change is weak, if you could implement as hard as you like, many resources, time, and so on, you will not achieve the desired result. So that's also important. And also we find with theory of change, if you ask a program manager who's trying to change a development result, what is your causal theory? I wonder how many will know. I did such research, and many of the program managers couldn't tell you what is the causal theory behind their program. They just said, no, we're doing this to address poverty. The causal chain or the causal theory. So, those are issues which are technical capabilities that should be there. Okay. Thank you. Poor theory of change, good theory of change, but poor implementation. You develop a new drug master plan. Very good, well researched. But the practitioners are still implementing the old one. So your implementation is not aligned to your strategy. And that happens quite often as well. And then the issue of context. We often fail to consider the internal and external context. And now my most controversial point, the audit culture. I love the AGSA. They play a key role. They do a lot of important work. But the dominance of the audit culture in government has resulted in the entire system planning for audit outcomes rather than planning for results. It's extremely prevalent. So people don't care, even if you look at the legislature, or parliament, they want to look at where you failed your reds. They don't say, okay, well, here you've achieved, and we're going to replicate that. The audit culture is extremely, I'm not against the AGSA, but I'm saying if audit culture determines your planning development, then you will fail. We've also learned a lot of lessons in the development of the medium-term development plan, including modernization, all the issues, new methodologies, foresighting, anticipatory governance and modeling. But we have these insights. But DPME, I don't think DPME will get, and DPME should have, good afternoon, Minister. DPME should have permanent modeling and foresighting capacity. But the HR people will say no. Treasury will say you don't have money. But the cost of not having that money is much more severe than, so there's that. Then there's the issue of the rigidities. Let me just mention some of these systems. In the public service system, the procurement system, I think other colleagues have also spoken to this. But what we have is these rigid systems have not prevented fraud and corruption. They are there, supposedly, to stop fraud and corruption, but they haven't prevented fraud and corruption, as we've all seen on a daily basis. But the rigidities do not achieve the end result. Also, organizational structures. Ideally, your organizational structure should be based on your political mandate, should be based on your strategy. Do you think that happens? No, it doesn't happen. So let's say you have a beginning of an administration. It can take 5 years for the organizational structure to be changed. So those are some of the concerns. Recruitment processes. Okay. I mean, it can take, well, firstly, many posts are not filled. Who knows why? DG posts, DDG posts, and many posts throughout. But also the time that it takes to fill a vacancy. So, I hate comparing the public sector to the private sector, but the private sector can fill a vacancy within a week. It will take about 6 months to fill a senior. That affects the performance of the state. Obviously, the performance management system, you'll find a chief director putting in their performance agreement the number of meetings they attend. Okay. So I'm just saying, so that's also the results-based management issues and some of the things that we need to address. So thank you very much. I would have liked to speak longer, but the streamlining and modernization of government structures is definitely something we have to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all the discussants this morning that have engaged the volume, and I think we can all attest to the fact that we have heard the policy recommendation the discussions and I think that there has clearly been an emphasis on the question targeted functionality and coalitions around specific problems where we can insulate the state to deliver on key problems and ensuring that the riddled politics does not continuously infiltrate the state and create dysfunction, as we've heard from the discussants, but also as Professor Susan Boysen has actually written extensively about that in the past. So we're now moving to the session where we get to engage and open it up for questions and comments as well. We do have an online audience as well that I'm sure have been posting their questions, and I will work with my colleague Njabulo to field the questions from the online audience as well as in the room. What I do suggest, given the time, is that we can first take 2 questions probably in the room, and then we'll move to online and we can come back to the room after that, so that everybody gets a chance, or as many people as possible can get a chance to engage. I remind everybody in the room and online that you can still engage on social media platforms. We won't be able to exhaust all the questions and comments in this sitting. And we also ask that you do pardon us, because we will just go over time by only 15 minutes. So we'll conclude the discussion session at 1:10, and then we'll have 5 minutes closing by Dr. Africa. So any 2 questions, please? Okay, so I recognize 1, the second person. I recognize 2, and then we probably come back to you. So please introduce yourself and then say your question or comment.
Thank you very much. I'm Malachi from the Palabo Outlet. I greet everyone. I think not to waste time. I think all protocol has been observed. It is very important for us to understand. I think everyone has spoken about the government and the institutions and things like that. But what is important is also about the people. Who are we in this equation? And I think you've spoken about the civil societies. What we know in African norms and in African culture is that for every activity that we do, have debriefing and we have cleansing. And we were all called upon this to fight for this freedom in all ways we can. Stones, fires, everything with our lives. We got the freedom. There was never a proper debriefing and cleansing to say, okay, now all of you have been fighting for this, and who are you now in this equation? And as you can see, this is now going into, as we have any form of grievances with the government, we go back to where we were before the apartheid. We're still burning the libraries, we demolishing buildings and roads, because we don't know who are we. The promise was to say is a better life for all. What does that even mean? Does it mean RDPs are solving the problem for us? Does it mean now we are seeing people becoming rich and richer? Our traditional leaders are also floating in the system. What is our job? What are we supposed to do? Are we just the owners? Are we just the title deed owners of the land? But what do we do for our people? What is happening? And as a result, the people have not been cleansed. We know in African culture that if someone dies or any activity happens, they don't even get into the yard. But what we are seeing now, our people are on drugs, on alcohol, they are in pains, and we don't even know what to do with regards to that. I think that's my comment. The cost of education, everyone is saying we must go to school. The cost of education is expensive. It's impossible to study anything. We don't have the skills. We don't have the training. We don't have the practices. People, our brothers from Africa, they've had a little bit of mileage beforehand of education, of experience and all those kind of things. We are here. We don't know how to contribute to the society. And as a result, breaking it down.
Thank you very much, Chief, for all those points. And I think it's very important because people must come into the room. It really is about identity, about dignity, and about meaning. And I like what you're saying, Chief, around even the meaning of a better life for all. People saying about that meaning creation is very important. I think that the volume does try to at least cover some of that, but I think that a 2.0 is definitely necessary to look more into that. So thank you very much for that. And then we have our second question in the room before we move online. Sir, please introduce yourself and say your question or comment.
My name is Alvin Rapea. I'm standing up because the chief's both standing, so I have to follow that example. You have spoken, and I'm going to speak about the culture, not from the tradition, but organizational culture. I've noted in terms of the key findings, in capacity and skills, you talk about weak professional cultures, and I don't know whether it's deliberate to say cultures in plural, but we have to explain that, because I get worried when you talk about professional cultures, because if the multiples of them, then it becomes a problem. And Mr. Machite also spoke about it, say there's conflicting cultures, there's an embedded public administration culture, and you also in the findings say there's a long way to go before the culture of corruption is rooted out from state. And there's a recommendation which says promote a culture of ethics. For me, it says there's a culture problem in the public. What kind of culture is existing, and what kind of culture should exist for us to get out of where we are and become a productive nation? For examples that were given about China, this is culture that you can define in terms of the culture of Chinese public administration or public sector or the state. What is the kind of culture that we have? Something that in your new the second version of this report, that you can consider delving into it. It doesn't matter if you bring in highly skilled professionals in the public service, as long as the culture is not right. You get absorbed into that. I've got experience with the police. We used to do the state of policing in South Africa. And you find that they get taught about the code of conduct at colleges. When they get into a police station, you get told that what you learned in the colleges, here, this is how things, and they get taught wrong things by the people who are supposed to direct them differently.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important point. You know, one of the founding principles of the volume of this volume is the definition of institutions, the classic definition of institutions as rules of the game that structure human interaction. And the whole point around that definition is also about the underlying incentives that pervade society. What's the reward system in society? And I think that the authors there also grapple with the question of culture, the relationship between culture and institutions. What do we mean when we're talking about culture? What do we mean when we're talking about institutions? It links to the chief's point as well around African norms and around the African identity as well, because all of this is very useful in structuring a culture that works for us as a people, that recognizes inherently who we are, what we reward, what we punish as a society, and how we want to see ourselves moving forward in a productive way and in a cohesive way. We hope that some of that is in the volume. I think it certainly is, but I think the way that you're putting it is giving pertinence to this particular issue. Njabulo, there are two or three questions online.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. Hope everyone can hear me, especially the online audience. So there are two questions, both for Minister Mohopa and Yeni. I'll start with those questions. They both come from Orapeleng Matsiliso. So the question for the minister is that since you state that the NDP is both the vision and policy, now in monitoring and evaluating the NDP, can you give us some reflective assessment of 13 years of the NDP in terms of its achievements and setbacks, more so since we are left with only 4 years before 2030? And then the question for Prof. Vigeni, as the chairperson of the Public Service Commission, do you think there were enough efforts to build a capable and ethical state as outlined in Chapter 13 of the NDP, particularly issues such as political interference in the administration of appointments of public servants in the state institutions?
Thank you. Thank you.
There's more questions, but yeah.
Let's start with those, I think. Okay. All right. So I'm hoping that the minister, you could hear the question that is being directed to you. So just to perhaps capture the essence of the question, it relates to the NDP as a vision and a national policy, given that we've been 13 years into the NDP and we have about 4 years left of it. Could you please reflect on the achievements and perhaps the setbacks relating to the NDP? What perhaps could be done in the remaining 4 years to try and achieve some of those in the NDP?
Sure,
maybe she's pointing.
All right. All right. While we wait for the minister and checking with the minister, could we please then move on to the second question directed at Professor Fikeni Somadoda around his reflections or your reflections, Professor, on whether you think that enough efforts have been made to build the state. Once again, in reflecting on the NDP, what has been achieved in the NDP, and thinking about 2030 fast approaching. So,
I think it's there.
Okay. So it's possible. So it's possible that the minister and professor have stepped away. So I think that we acknowledge those questions. There are questions that have to be reflected on certainly, and I think that it's work that can be done at a later point. I think let me move on back to the room with two questions, and I think that those are the only questions or comments that we can take. I'll take yours. You had raised your hand first, and then please introduce yourself and
My name's David on one side. David Lewis. I'm surprised that there's been so little mention of the fact that A, we're by no means the only state in crisis. B, all the most acute crises seem to be in liberal democratic states. And C, until Stambile spoke, underlying those crises in social democratic states are crises in political parties. Whether you're talking about the US or Britain or Germany or Italy or Kenya or South Africa, the failure of political parties is at the bottom of it all. And we need to speak about, is it possible to regulate political parties, which at the moment are, except for their finances, completely unregulated? And they're treated in the same way as a local tennis club would be treated, despite their huge influence in everybody's life. And the fact that the only states that seem not to be in this crisis are are autocratic states like China and increasingly like where they do seem to be delivering, maybe on a set of objectives that we don't all agree with, but they're delivering on their objectives. And they're all autocratic states that seem to succeed in doing that. So that's the one political point that I wanted to make on the question of